If you're finding the Iliad difficult to read, it's probably because, well, in one part it's poetry, which means you have to do a lot of extra thinking for each wording, each characterization of something. Also, it's a very different time and place. There's a lot going on. It's complicated, the action that's being described. But it also violates our modern expectation that the author communicates as efficiently and simply as possible what's going on. And so we read a lot of extra verbiage and we're wondering, do I need to pay attention to this? Do I need to remember this? Do I need to remember this name later on? Do I need to pay attention to this characterization, this simile that's going on for several lines? And as a heuristic, as a sort of guide, we're looking for something to focus our attention. To determine whether something's important or not, we usually look for some sort of rule of thumb to follow. And that's usually figuring out who the protagonist is and then focusing on what is directly relevant to them. So let's say Achilles is the hero, the protagonist of the Iliad, and we can just focus on the scenes that he's in and the things that are going to directly impact him. If we follow that heuristic, that rule of thumb, we're going to do the same thing that a lot of people do, and even a lot of abridgments of the Iliad that shorten, that cut out a lot of it. They very often cut out Book 2 entirely. Because if Achilles is the hero, and we're only paying attention to what affects the hero, then we don't need to pay attention to Book 2 because he doesn't appear in Book 2, or Book 3, or Book 4, or 5, or 6, or 7, or 8. He's not going to show up again until Book 9. So does that mean books 2 through 8 are mistakes? They're not really necessary. That usual way of just focusing on the main characters and ignoring everyone else sets us up to make the same mistake that Achilles is going to make, or at least that Apollo in book 24 is going to accuse Achilles of. That is, being anisimos. Now, obviously, anisimos is a Greek term, and I could give you an English term to replace it. The translators usually use something like justice, but that's not exactly what anisimos is, and that's not exactly what Achilles' problem ends up being. I can give you a longer explanation, but keep in mind that words can't communicate knowledge. They don't just take knowledge from the speaker and put it in the listener. You have to have a schema, a concept of what this refers to, and all a word can do is trigger certain associations from what you yourself have experienced. So rather than give you an explanation, which is going to be inadequate, I'm going to say just hang on, we'll come back to anisimos. We'll come back to the attempt to translate it into something more concrete. Maybe as late as book 24. But we have to actually have the experience of what it is before we can see whether or not Achilles or we are culpable of this error. So to have that experience, it might connect to something that you actually have experienced, but if not, the narrative itself is going to lead you through. It's going to lead you through witnessing anisimos and the effects it has, how it emerges, what it looks like, how it affects people. Then you'll have a clearer experience of what it is. So narrative does this. It doesn't just say, like, here's information from the story. It engages in diegesis, that is, this leading you through these experiences. You see what this character thinks, you see why this character thinks that, what this character is responding to, what this character does, and then what the other characters do in response, how they were affected by this. That leading process, Homer is taking us through this sequence of events, not just to know what happened, but to know why it happened and how it happened. So I'll come back to anisimos much later. For right now, a good Greek word to remember is diegesis. Homer's going to get us there. Every word is important. Even if you don't know why yet, these descriptions are there for a reason. And you've probably figured out once you start to read book 2 that reason is not to figure out what's going on with Achilles. Achilles isn't the only thing we're supposed to focus on. The opening lines of the poem start, "Goddess, sing of the cataclysmic wrath of great Achilles, son of Peleus." In other words, Achilles is not the subject of the sentence. The noun of address is goddess. Homer is asking this muse to sing to him, not about Achilles himself, not about the life of Achilles, not about Achilles' battle with Hector, but about the cataclysmic wrath. The Greek term is menos. And cataclysmic wrath is Emily Wilson's translation. Others, as I've mentioned before, have different translations. But it's not just an emotion, and to really understand what that is, we're going to have to follow it And now that we're in book 2, Achilles is not present, but that wrath is. That meanness is still there. Remember that in book 1, he passed that on to his mother Thetis, who then passed it on to Zeus. And now Zeus has the meanness. He's the one who's going to inflict that meanness on the Greeks. All because of this conflict that began between Achilles and Agamemnon, but it will not remain limited to them. Now, if you're like most people, you probably looked at this image and you focused on the guy in front. We're going to use that for Achilles, although Achilles could look like anything as long as he's got long chestnut-colored hair. That's usually the way it's translated. But if you focus on the guy in the middle, you're only focusing on around 15% of the total image. And there are a lot of other people in that image. He's also in sharper focus than the rest. If, like in any AI image, you look at the guys in the background, you're going to see that they're quite a bit distorted or out of focus or just strange. And AI, just like people, tends to blur and distort images and information that it doesn't think are that important. And when I tried to get it several times, I spent quite a bit of time trying to get this image to be in the state it's in. The AI just continually relegates these background people to sort of non-importance, visual non-importance. But that's because it learns from its training data, and who generated the training data? Humans did. This is what humans do as well. We focus on Achilles, we tend to ignore all the people around him. In any war movie, there's always going to be the infantry, the common troops. They're in the background. We can't focus on the suffering and the effort of all of them. We have to focus on one or a few protagonists or heroes or main characters. But just like we do this with the image, we probably also did it with the lines, the opening lines of book 1. So yes, he starts with the invocation of the muse. He wants the muse to sing to him about the meanness of Achilles. But immediately after that, he follows by describing the Greeks. The Greeks, or Achaeans, the Emily Wilson translation, unlike most translation, uses Greeks, even though that term doesn't exist at this point during Homer's time. But the Achaeans, the Greeks, were the recipients of that immeasurable pain. They were the ones who were sent down to Hades. So many noble souls of heroes sent down to Hades, and men made the spoils for dogs, a banquet for the birds. In other words, carrion. So just in these opening 8.5 lines that compose this extended sentence, Achilles is mentioned twice, of great Achilles, son of Peleus, and then at the end, between the conflict between Agamemnon and glorious Achilles. But the men who are going to suffer receive 3 lines, and yet how often do we really focus on them? So Homer's audience was probably not any different than we are today. Homer's audience was looking to hear about Achilles. They were looking to hear about the battlefield heroics of Achilles, the power, the skill, the battles against Hector and others. But Homer, in book 2, upsets their expectations the same way he upsets ours. He takes the hero out of the story, and his narration guides us through. It focuses us on people that we might not normally pay attention to, probably wouldn't normally pay attention to. That is, these Greeks who will be the ones who suffer from Achilles' meanness. So not only do we, as readers, and Homer's audience tend to just take these guys for granted, but so too the characters do as well. Agamemnon just sort of assumes he knows how these characters think, and we see very quickly that he's wrong. The gods think they understand how these characters think, and we see very quickly that they're wrong. And we realize with this miscalculation, this misunderstanding of the important people with the common troops, that the common troops are the backbone of the Achaean war effort, the Greek possibility of taking Troy. Without them, it doesn't matter how good a fighter Achilles is. It doesn't matter about the rest of the princes, the chieftains of the Achaeans. They have to have these men there with them, protecting them so that they can achieve their heroics. And when Agamemnon slips up and the men start to pack up the ships, get ready to go home, they realize very quickly how important these guys are and how essential it is that they get these guys to do something that is not actually in their best interest. That's what book 2 is all about. And at the end of book 2, that's when we are given the catalog of the ships, which is a long recitation about just how many of these guys there actually are. Now, we start with Zeus and Agamemnon. Zeus is thinking about how to enact this revenge, or at least this embarrassment, this humiliation of Agamemnon. And he does so by sending him a dream where he promises him victory over the city of Troy through this dream. And this false dream is personified as if it was its own character. And then in the dream, as it appears to Agamemnon, this false dream takes the form of Nestor, someone Agamemnon trusts and listens to. But to understand what Zeus is thinking, we've got to use theory of mind. That is the sort of clunky psychological term I've talked about in the last couple of lectures, where we try to imagine what someone else is thinking. And it gets really complicated when we have to imagine what somebody else is thinking that someone else thinks, that a third person thinks. So here, we have to follow along as Homer describes Zeus thinking, okay, well, here's what Agamemnon will respond to. Here's how Agamemnon will think. Because Agamemnon trusts Nestor, so I will send a dream that takes the form of Nestor, because Agamemnon will think that this is good advice, and then he will act accordingly, taking the Greeks to the city of Troy, taking the battle to the Trojans when it's maybe a little too soon, when he actually doesn't have the resources and the opportunity that he thinks he does. So we have to meta-represent. That is, we have to think about what Agamemnon's thinking, and we have to think about what Zeus is thinking, and we also have to think about what Agamemnon thinks that Zeus is thinking. So we've got 4 meta-representations here. Meta-representation number 1, we know what Zeus is thinking. He's going to make good on his promise to Thetis, and Thetis made him make that promise because she wanted to have her son's embarrassment punished, and she wants to embarrass Agamemnon. So Zeus is thinking, I need to make the Greeks lose. Meta-representation number 2, we know what Agamemnon is thinking. He wants to conquer Troy. He's an Achaean, he's leading the Achaeans, and he's not going to take his troops to battle unless he thinks they can actually take the city, or at least make gains toward taking the city. He's not going to take them into battle if he thinks that there's only the possibility of loss. But then there's meta-representation number 3. What Agamemnon thinks Zeus is thinking. So if he knows this dream comes from Zeus, he's going to think that, well, Zeus is going to tell me the truth. Zeus has sent me a message of victory, and specifically the story that dream personified tells Agamemnon is that Hera changed the minds of the other gods. That means that Agamemnon already knew that many of the gods, including Zeus, had not yet agreed to give victory to the Greeks. And Hera and Athena did want to give victory to the Greeks. So it would make more sense if we gave Agamemnon a better explanation. And the explanation here requires us to know that Agamemnon thinks that Hera is on his side, and she would have the capability of changing the minds of the other gods. So here we have, yet another level. I'm going to just focus on 4 meta-representations here, but you can see how this is getting complicated quickly. So essentially, meta-representation number 3 is Agamemnon thinks that Zeus is now on his side, that Zeus is sending him a message of victory. Then we have meta-representation number 4, and that is what Zeus thinks that Agamemnon thinks. He knows that Agamemnon will interpret this dream as a promise of immediate victory, and that will cause him to make careless decisions, use poor strategy, get a little reckless in his attack on Troy, and that recklessness will cause a lot of Greek casualties. But I want to make this a little bit more complicated. There is a 5th meta-representation here. That is one of the few times the narrator steps in and wants us to be clear on what's actually happening here. Homer wants to make especially clear that Agamemnon is wrong. Not just wrong, but he is being foolish. Homer tells us then Agamemnon's heart imagined things that would not come to pass. Just, spoiler alert here, which a spoiler alert isn't something that really exists for the Greeks at this time. But he's letting us know, don't be fooled. There will be some victories and some losses, but this is going to be a loss. Homer wants us to be very clear that Agamemnon was foolish. He calls him poor fool. The term there is for a child or someone who just acts impulsively without any forethought. The god intended to bring pain and grief to both Greeks and Trojans through fierce fighting. So just to make sure everybody knows Agamemnon's wrong, he's wrong because Zeus fooled him. That little aside there is going to be important later on, because we're going to we might sort of forget it, and then we're going to miss something very important when we get to the rallying of the troops by Odysseus. So Agamemnon wakes up. He tells all the other Greek princes, the other sort of lower kings, that he's had this dream, and the dream was Zeus's promise of victory. And this goes well with what they've already thought. They've heard long ago that there were prophecies that they would take the city of Troy. So today's the day. So he tells all his commanders, today's the day. But then, and here's a part that really confuses a lot of readers of the Iliad, he then goes and tells the rest of them, he after this sort of generals conference, he then calls together all the other troops who all, come around. They're all camped out in the around the beach chips on the Trojan coast. They all come together and listen to Agamemnon give a speech, and he tells them the opposite of what he thinks. This gets confusing because he's actually telling them something closer to the truth, but he thinks he's lying. This is a morale test. He's looking to see if what we call the sunk cost fallacy kicks in. That is, when you've spent a lot of time and effort, or maybe spent a lot of money or resources on something, and you just keep failing to get it, you might not be able to get that cost that you paid back already. You're not going to get it back. But that usually leads us to spend even more, as if somehow the new effort and the new money we contribute to this is going to be added on to the past effort. But the past effort is actually gone. They're still at the beach. They haven't made a lot of ground. It's not like they're holding a lot of territory between the beach and Troy. So they're not actually losing much if they were to give up and go back home. And in this speech, Agamemnon makes a pretty good case about why they should go home, why they should give up. Troy has a numeric advantage. They have the home field advantage. They have the population of their own there, and they're getting reinforcements from elsewhere. Historically, Troy was in an on-again, off-again alliance, sometimes rivalry, but more often alliance with the Hittite Empire. In an actual war, they would have likely gotten reinforcements. If they're fighting against the Mycenaeans, they would be getting those reinforcements from the Hittites. In the epic cycle, that is the next epic, which is the Aethiopus, this is where the Ethiopians and the Amazons come to reinforce the Trojans. So that is true. He's right. Troy has a numeric advantage. He also knows these soldiers want to go home. He mentions his own sort of desire to go home, to be back with his family, rather than being here and risking death and wasting more time getting nothing. Why don't we just go home? But he's counting on that sunk cost fallacy to outweigh those other ways of thinking. He's thinking that the soldiers are going to go, no, we've been here this long, let's go all the way and have this sort of surge of vigor and desperation, like, oh, this is our last chance. If we don't take Troy today, then Agamemnon's going to make us go home. He's sort of assuming they're going to have that response. And he is wrong. He was right about the numeric advantage. He was right about them wanting to go home. But his assumption that they wanted to take Troy so badly and that they wouldn't want to give up now, that's not very good theory of mind. That's not a very good meta-representation. It's a good explanation of how Agamemnon thinks, but that's kind of the problem. The soldiers don't think the way Agamemnon thinks. Now, why might that be? It's as if he stands to benefit more than they do, and he stands to risk less than they do. Obviously, as Achilles has already pointed out, Agamemnon doesn't get out on the battlefield very much. He doesn't risk his life very much. But he is the one who gets to keep the large majority of treasure, and he's the one who's really going to benefit if they take Troy. So here again, we have to keep track of four minds, minds within minds. We have to keep track of what Agamemnon is thinking. We have to keep track of what the Achaean troops are thinking. And then we have to keep track of what Agamemnon thinks the Achaean, the Greek troops are thinking, and what the Greek troops think that Agamemnon is thinking. And a side note, I'm going to put terms that you need to know for quizzes in the class. I'm going to put those in red the first time you see them, so you definitely want to write them down. But if I've gone over a term before, I expect you already have it in your notes. I'm going to put that in blue. So if you see something in blue, that means that you do need to know this, but this is not the first time we've talked about it. So remember Achilles' whole resentment of Agamemnon back in book one. This getos, this gift of honor, this battlefield trophy, that is a human being named Briseis, was taken away from him and given to Agamemnon. And so Achilles lets loose with his argument about how Agamemnon really doesn't do any of the work. He just sits back at the camp. But yet he gets to take all the reward. He gets to take, basically credit for it, as if he was there on the battlefield. He has the highest time, that is the highest honor, the highest status. And Nestor tries to explain why in book one. That is, he has the most troops. He brought more troops than Achilles did. So he has more time, more honor, more status, more power. Well, wait a second. So his time depends on having those troops. And these are the troops that he seems to have a hard time understanding. And, if you have enough time, if you're well known enough, if you demonstrate kudos on the battlefield, you would achieve getos, trophies to show your accomplishments on the battlefield, and that raises your time. And then you die, people will continue to talk about you. That is, you will have that fame, that reputation, that kleos. And if you have enough of it, that kleos will be undying. That is kleos optaton. That is what Achilles is hyper focused on, and losing this getos, losing this woman who is a trophy to him, is a threat to that. His kleos is imperiled, and so because of that, he's going to remove himself from the fighting. Well, if Agamemnon is pursuing kleos, he wants to get all the getos, get all the treasure, but also take the city of Troy and be remembered as the one, one leading an army of other ones, but he wants to be the one who took Troy. He probably has that sort of sunk cost fallacy in mind. He probably does think, okay, I'm so close to taking this prize, it'll make the last 10 years worth it if I can just conquer the city of Troy. And if anybody told me that I have to turn back now and go home, I would say, no, we're so close, I'm going to commit everything. I'm going to be even more energized to finish the job right now. But he thinks his troops are going to feel that way as well. But that's where there's a problem, because he has failed to notice that they don't get the same reward for risking their lives. They're out there doing the fighting. If Achilles is complaining about him, he himself has to go out there on the battlefield and win this stuff. Well, Agamemnon is doing even less. But how much more are these ordinary guys doing? And how much do we hear their names? What chance at kleos do they have? What chance at status do they have? Is the blood you shed on the battlefield directly proportional to your teammate, to your status? Well, no. The guys who are out there getting killed and wounded and maimed, they're not suddenly more higher ranking than Achilles or Agamemnon or anyone else who is the one that they who gets to ride the chariot into battle defended by these infantry. And it's just as easy for us, the audience, to ignore these guys on whom this war depends, to ignore, to look at the status of Agamemnon, but forget that, as Nestor points out, and doesn't seem to be aware of himself, that status is entirely dependent on leading all of these other nameless men. And we as an audience are tempted to ignore them, just like Agamemnon and Achilles do. But Homer's going to make that difficult. Homer can't stop. As a narrator, every narrator has to leave out a lot of the story because there's too much to any story to include everything in the narrative. So in this second invocation of the muse that comes at the end of the action of book 2, but right before what's called the catalog of the ships, where he sort of lists off who came from what nation and how many did they bring. A lot of times people look at this as, well, why is this sort of an aside? What does this have to do with the story at this point? What does this have to do with the Manus of Achilles? Well, if the Manus of Achilles is threatening the Greeks, these are the Greeks. This is how many there are. This is how many people have a stake in this particular conflict, not the Trojan War, alone, but also this specific conflict in the Iliad. And so he has a second invocation of the muse where he says, now muses, tell me, you who have your houses high on the Mount Olympus, for you are goddesses, you're here, you know everything, you see it all, while we can only listen to the stories. We have seen nothing, and we do not know. Who were the lords and the leaders of the Greeks? Okay, that's the first thing he wants to know. But then, I could not name or tell the multitude. I could not name each of these multitude of people that follows these leaders. All I can do as a narrator is just talk about the leaders. Just name the leaders. Give them the kleos that they were out there fighting for. Not even if I had 10 tongues, 10 mouths, a voice that never broke, a heart of bronze. So only, not even if I was superhuman, I could not name every single person who shed blood out on the battlefields of Troy. I couldn't give them the kleos that they deserved. So if Achilles is right, that he deserves this kleos, that he should not have it taken away from him, what about all these other guys? And so this catalog of the ships goes, gives the numbers of people that came. He'll say, like, here's the king from this city, and here's how many troops he brought on how many ships. So he can list them out like that, but, how much does, being told numbers really create a picture? What he's trying to do there is something that we take for granted. Today, if you were told that this army of tens of thousands of people were on the march, you could probably imagine what it would look like to stand on a hill and look over there and see thousands and thousands of men with shields and spears and shining helmets marching up the hill. Have you ever seen that yourself? Well, probably not. But you've seen this in movies. In a movie, we can, with thousands of extras, like in old Hollywood or just computer-generated troops today, we can show you, okay, here's a few faces close up, but then zoom out and just see these thousands and thousands of people just like them. Hand that to you visually without having to ask you to imagine something you've never seen. But Homer can't do that. Homer's audience, even if they've been in a war, they probably haven't been in a war where that many people were moving. Even beyond, most battles at the time might involve hundreds of people, not tens of thousands. Many others of his audience have never seen anything like that. So how is he going to communicate to them what this would look like? They don't have the schema. They don't have this mental model of what that looks like because they've never been able to see that many people. So remember, a schema is just this sort of model of something in reality, but the model is in your head. And it might not, and usually doesn't, perfectly resemble the reality. But if you don't even have the schema, you don't even have a way to imagine what is being described. Just having the words, something described to you that you've never seen, the words mean nothing. The best you can do is attach it to something that is the next best thing. Something similar to what's being described, but maybe not exactly what's being described. And that is something that a simile will exploit. A simile, as you probably learned in high school, is a comparison between two different things, and the way people often, the shorthand version of separating it from a metaphor is that a simile does not use the words like or as. Not always entirely true, and there's a lot more to it than that, but the like and the as they're sort of they're words that let us know this is a comparison of two different things. Whereas a metaphor doesn't let us know. It might actually be describing one thing in terms of the other, but we might actually be confused sometimes. This is why we have cognitive metaphors as well as literary metaphors, where sometimes we think the two things are basically the same, and they're really not. That's the closest thing. So for Homer to get us to imagine what it would look like to see these tens of thousands of people on the move, he gives us several of these similes, several comparisons. It's like when a deadly fire blazes through the forest across mountain peaks. From afar, the gleam is visible. So you can imagine, and maybe you've never seen a forest fire, but there you've probably seen one on TV. But people at his time very well may have seen forest fires, especially from a distance where you can see it burning in the distance. So it's just like that, so brightly shown the shimmering brightness of the majestic bronze as men advance. So they're so far away, all you see is the sunlight reflecting off of their bronze helmets and shields and that sort of thing. It would be like a fire going up the mountain. Just as when the many flocks of geese or cranes or long-necked swans take wing across the meadow in Lydia around the streams of the Castor, they soar in all directions, relishing their wings. Then with loud cries they swoop and settle so that the fen resounds with noise. So many flock to Scamander's plain, that is the plain of the river Scamander, from the ships and the tents. Okay, so this might be something his audience has actually seen. And if they've never seen tens of thousands of humans marching, they may have at least seen these big swarms of geese. And you're going to see this a lot through the Iliad. Again, Homer has to represent something that his audience might not have the schema, the mental model to imagine. So he has to think, well, what do they have schemas for? And what is the closest thing? What would give them enough information to construct this schema for a thing that they've never seen? And he'll spend several lines doing this a lot of times. So a lot of times it becomes confusing, especially if you ever try to translate this from the Greek. What are we talking about here? Like all of a sudden we're talking about a lion attacking a shepherd and his sheep. Is this happening during the war, or is this something that happened before, when it's actually just a simile? Because this happens so often and it's something that's so necessary, we call this an epic simile. This is, Homer, or, in other epics as well, looking for the next best thing to describe something that is too epic that people have just never seen before. The audience would have never seen anything like this, but that's precisely why they want to hear this epic. They want this imagery, but they need some help putting together schemas from things that they have experienced so that they can assemble in their mind something they haven't. So the epic simile is just an extended simile that usually is going to take something from the everyday world and compare it to the world of war, or the world of the epic. And it's there to give the audience this sense of being there. So think of this as like a, IMAX experience for people that don't have film, don't have video. They have to use what they've seen in their own reality and maybe take bits and pieces of those and combine them together into the kind of schema that's the next best thing to having the memory from having been there.
So once Homer is able to get the audience to schematize, to imagine based on their presumed actual experience with things like swarms of bees or flocks of geese, once they get a clear visual schema, visual model, they can then apply that and better understand the numbers that he gives in the catalog of the ships. It's at that point, after these epic similes, that he comes in with that second invocation of the muse and says, I could not name the multitude, even if I had 10 tongues, 10 mouths, voice that never broke, heart of bronze. It's at that point that the reader or the audience can really comprehend, really imagine what it would look like for all of these people who should be named but will not be named, cannot be named, but deserve to be named. That's when he goes through that catalog of the ships and gives you all of the sort of literally unsung heroes. And I like to compare this to the opening titles, especially back in the old days, old Hollywood, they used to have the credits right at the beginning. Sometimes you'll still see this in episodes of a TV show where they introduce the conflict in the opening scene with, few credits, if any. And then after they introduce that conflict, you get the show title, the theme of the show, the music, and that sort of thing. And you'll have credits that go there. And these are the people that make that movie or that TV show possible. But all you're going to see is like these names that sort of briefly go by. And sometimes it's just the name of the company that people work for. They won't actually see their own names. It's kind of like that here. And this is where, after establishing the conflict that gives birth to the Manus of Achilles, that very specific focus on Achilles and the wrath that will go on to bring harm to all these people, and then we sort of zoom out and see just how many people are here in this larger setting, the setting of the Trojan War. And by doing this, Homer is again foregrounding those who would be in the background by spending most of this book focusing on people that we just sort of take for granted. We know they're there, but he's asking us to pay special attention to them and also to realize how much the main characters and even the gods take them for granted until they are deciding to go home. Then they suddenly realize how important these guys are. They're not just background. So this is foregrounding. This is calling our attention to something that was there the whole time, but we could have kept going without paying special attention to. When I use that word foregrounding, I'm going to expand on how this gets used, especially in literary criticism, because it doesn't just mean images or characters or events that are in the background in this portrayal. It might call attention to the way a story is told or an expectation the audience has. It might call attention to something in our social set of expectations, our cultural norms, conventions, things that we typically don't pay attention to. And a case in point of that is here, not only is Homer foregrounding these men that we could otherwise overlook, but also our expectation that they are not important. And recall Nestor's argument to Achilles in Book 1 that even though Agamemnon doesn't go out and do the fighting, he can't fight as well as Achilles is. His time, his status as the head of all the Greeks, even all the other Greek chieftains, is based on the fact that he has this multitude of men at his command. This is just bringing into our awareness, as well as potentially the character's awareness, that, yeah, that time is not coming from Agamemnon himself. It is absolutely dependent on these men that choose to serve him. And by foregrounding the number and the importance of this multitude of warriors, Homer is kind of pointing out how the Nestor's rationale for Agamemnon's power kind of falls apart. And if his teammate is entirely dependent on the ability to command these men, well, that's a loose foundation. And when we recognize their anonymity, we also recognize the injustice that they're going to suffer because they don't have the same shot at Kleos. Their names are not going to be remembered. And if that's a big deal for Achilles, it's an even bigger deal for these tens of thousands of men. And that should make it all the more ironic that it's these men, these nameless men who are suffering the fate that Achilles is afraid of, losing Kleos. They are actually the ones who are going to suffer from Achilles' sense of indignation. It's not Agamemnon. We still remember Agamemnon's name, but it's his men that are already anonymous. They're the ones who are going to suffer and die more because of the meanness of Achilles. You've probably seen some version of Edgar Rubin's famous example of negative space in his image of a vase that, if you look at the white image, it looks like a vase or a candlestick or something like that. But if you don't look at that, you may notice that there are two faces in black that are face to face. So which one is the image he intended to focus on? Well, it's really up to you. So this use of negative space in visual art, you can see the same thing sort of happening in Homer's foregrounding of the anonymous multitude of warriors that surround the main characters like Achilles and Agamemnon. And this theme that is being introduced here is that Achilles is part of a larger whole. There's a whole lot of things going on around him that his conflict, however justified it may or may not be, whatever the effects of it are, he is not alone. It is not just him and Agamemnon. There is a whole lot more going on here, and his actions, what happens to him is in part affected by all these other things, but also his individual actions are going to have this ripple effect throughout this negative space, throughout this background of these anonymous guys who are going to be just as invested in these events as any of the main characters. And this is, in literature, a form of defamiliarization. It doesn't just meet our expectations. It's not trying to satisfy us. It's trying to dissatisfy us, make us stop and pay attention to something that we might not have paid attention to. And that might include taking emphasis away from some of the main characters. It might even involve making us look twice at a character that we like and that we think we know and that we risk being a little bit disappointed in. And that's going to be the case with Odysseus. Now, I will be the first to admit I am an Odysseus stan. We're going to later get into the distinction between the meanness that characterizes Achilles and the meanness that characterizes Odysseus. That is the ability to adapt, the ability not to be so rooted and implacable, like unable to detach from a particular situation or outcome, the way Achilles is. Achilles cannot get over this feeling of indignation, and for him, everything else just comes to a stop. Nothing can happen until that is resolved. Well, Odysseus, especially as we're going to see him in the Odyssey, is almost the polar opposite. That is, he is characterized by metis or polymetis, which in his introduction here, you're going to frequently see this epithet that he has the cunning that is equal to Zeus, and the word there that's translated in English as cunning is metis. And there's a whole book which I love. I highly recommend. It's originally in French, but the English translation is Cunning Intelligence in Greek Culture and Society. And it is all about this ideal, which we could translate as cunning or wit. But a lot of times there's English connotations in these words that don't exactly match this, and there are connotations in the Greek that don't exactly translate very well. So we'll see this, and Book 23 is really going to give us several examples of this concept, not just with Odysseus. But his role in Book 2 is much more specific. It's almost just like yet another subordinate of Agamemnon who is trying to keep everybody in line and willing to resort to sort of cruelty in order to keep everybody from breaking ranks. When Hera and Athena realize that Agamemnon's morale test has backfired and that all the Greeks are heading for the ships, they're packing up, they're ready to go home, they're happy about this. She goes, notice the gods can't interfere themselves or directly. They have to get humans to rally other humans to affect a victory on the battlefield. They're not just, they can't just step in and cause things to happen by divine magic or something. But Athena knows, okay, I'm going to go to Odysseus. He's the one that's going to be able to rally these troops. And he does that. So we're told that whenever he encountered an elite warrior, that is one of the upper class, people like Achilles, except he doesn't go to Achilles. Whenever he encounters one of the aristocratic warriors, he stood beside him and spoke to him calmly and held him back. He would say something like, "A spirit has possessed you. You must not be frightened like a coward or a peasant." So notice, peasants, lower class people, they're expected to be cowardly. He would say, "Sit down and make the others sit as well. You do not understand what Agamemnon intends to do. This is a test." So this is also, so we can, if we didn't understand yet that this is a morale test, Odysseus is explaining it. "He will soon smite the sons of Greece that they should fail. Did we all not hear him in the council?" So remember the council where Agamemnon explained the dream, which he thought was a promise for victory, that was just to the other chieftains. And so this is what Odysseus is reminding them about. And his justification to them is, "Great is the willfulness of rulers who enjoy the gods' protection, because their honor comes from Zeus, and Zeus is the god of strategy," that is Metis, and he loves them so much. This is very ironic for reasons we'll come back to if it's not already obvious. But notice the difference here. When he sees a common man shouting, that is the backbone troops, these are the multitude, he used his staff. This is the staff of Agamemnon that Odysseus has taken from him to show that he has the authority to speak on Agamemnon's behalf. So he's got that staff, and that is the same staff that Achilles looked at and compared to himself and the other Greeks. This is something that could have been a tree growing up back in Greece, but it was cut to make this symbol that symbolizes Agamemnon's power, but that will never grow into a tree, just like so many of these men who have come to Troy to serve Agamemnon. They will never be able to have their own lives. Their lives are going to be cut short, just like the life of this tree that is now just a scepter. But this is the scepter that Odysseus has, and he uses it to beat the common men, shouting at them. He used the staff to beat him back and called to him with orders and commands. "A spirit has possessed you. Now sit down, be quiet, pay attention to your betters, your superiors. You're a coward and unfit for battle, worthless in war and worthless in the council. We cannot all be rulers in this army. It is not good for many to share power. Only one man should rule and be master. That is the man whom the son of crooked Cronus," that is, dishonest father of Zeus, Cronus, "Zeus has bestowed this man with the staff and the laws by which the ruler makes plans for other men." Okay, again, the justification for the authority structure, the power pyramid, is that Zeus is the one who has chosen this one person, so this is in all of our best interest. We just follow him because he follows Zeus. And that's why, that's the way things are supposed to be. Again, remember how the book started. It's a little ironic. Now, as you know, Odysseus has his own epic, and if you read the Odyssey and you really liked him in that, you really sort of felt the travails that he went through, the difficulty that he has lying ahead of him. It might be a little disappointing to see him this cruel and this authoritarian and this sort of subservient to somebody like Agamemnon, who we've already sort of developed a bit of a distaste for. But keep in mind, this is the beginning of a very long character arc that will extend from this point, Book 2 in the Iliad, all the way to the end of the Odyssey. Maybe, depending on which of the epic cycle you regard as canon, maybe the telegony, but you can just as well leave that one off. It's a little weird. It doesn't really fit. But if you've read the Odyssey, you know Odysseus is going to learn what it's like to be the common man, the disrespected bottom of the pyramid. When he finally arrives in Ithaca and he has to disguise himself as a beggar, he's not in disguise as a common laborer. That class of people is above him. He's right there with foreigners and even it's kind of ambiguous, but even the slaves, because they are part of a household, they will outrank somebody who's just a wandering beggar. But he's going to be that like level that is not even on the pyramid. He's below it. And he's going to have to play that role until the point that he's able to kill all of the suitors. He's also going to see just how much the common people like Eumaeus are actually as virtuous, or in the case of the Ithacans, more virtuous than the majority of the aristocracy. But all of that lies ahead. So his character arc, he's got a lot to learn. He's got a lot to go through before he will really understand that. So if we're a little disappointed in him, don't be. This is his starting point. I think it's a good comparison to the Epic of Gilgamesh here. If you ever read Gilgamesh, at the very beginning, Gilgamesh is a complete jerk. He's abusive to his own people. It's only after he goes through this long journey and a lot of suffering and a lot of loss that he returns as the king that his people need him to be. Now, that said, this might be just a 21st century American way of looking back at this very structured power social hierarchy, and we might be imposing much later values that didn't exist at the time. That's always something we want to be careful of. But if we keep in mind what we've read so far just in Book 2, there's a pretty good reason to see that there are two ways of thinking going on here. This social hierarchy is definitely going to be one that is familiar to Homer's audience. It might be one that is taken for granted by Homer's audience. And keep in mind, though, Homer's audience is primarily going to be the upper class. They're the ones that he's going to be depending on for his livelihood, to be his patrons. But if we, as an audience, don't pick up on some of the irony here, we have this figure of Thersites that steps in and even more bluntly calls our attention to the disparity between the expectation of Agamemnon as a king and the reality of what we see happening in front of us. But Thersites, it's easy to mistake him. It's easy to think that, oh, Homer is disparaging this kind of thinking by disparaging this kind of character. And he is very blunt about the negative traits that Thersites has. He tells us, only foul-mouthed Thersites argued back against Odysseus. This man knew how to blather on for hours with pointless and irrelevant complaints against the rulers, anything he thought might raise a laugh among the other Greeks. He was the ugliest man who marched on Troy. So we are entirely justified in looking at this guy and thinking, okay, I don't like this guy already. He's ugly, he's loud, the heroes of the story don't like him, so I'm probably not going to like him either. But if we look at what he says, as opposed to how he's described, look at what he says and ask yourself, have I heard this before? When he says, you, son of Atreus, what do you need? What is your grievance? You already have huts full of bronze and full of hand-picked women who we, Greek warriors, assign to you. You get the first choice when we take the towns. You've already got the majority of the gold. You've already got, you can get more gold if you ransom some of the princes that we, on the battlefield, captured. You can take the spoils that we fought for, we bled for. And he even goes so far as to point out that Achilles was right. We were just told that he scolded Achilles a lot, but now we're told that he's actually, we see him actually siding with Achilles, recognizing Achilles is a better man by far. Achilles could have killed Agamemnon, but he let things go. Now, we might not be thinking Achilles lets things go, because the whole point of the Iliad is he doesn't let this thing go. But he didn't kill Agamemnon. We can say that for sure already. He doesn't know, obviously, about Athena talking Achilles out of it. But this speech has some very tight parallels with the speech that Achilles gave when he was ridiculing Agamemnon, saying almost the same things. Criticizing Agamemnon for being the greediest, the one who has nothing to complain about. If he had to give up one of his hostages, that is Chryseis, he's got nothing to complain about because he's got so many more, so much other getos, so much other reward for fighting that he did not do. As Achilles points out, and Thersites also points out, he is taking the getos, the reward, from someone else, from his own allies. Achilles is the one who was awarded these honors, and Agamemnon is just taking them arbitrarily. and they're both advocating going home. So Achilles just said the same thing. He said he was going to go home to Thea. Now Thersites, this terrible thing he's saying that's so horrifying to Odysseus, is exactly the same thing that Achilles himself just said. If we're not going to be honored here, if we don't get time for our actions, if we have to give it all to you, we may as well go home. So if we see this same basic speech happen twice, it's both these speeches are aimed at Agamemnon. In two different scenarios, we see a veteran warrior who's been out there on the battlefield questioning the distribution of Gedas and the ranking of time. When we see the same thing happening multiple times, this is called a motif. And don't confuse the word motif with the word trope. Trope specifically refers to the literary device as a literary device. It doesn't refer to the specific thing in the text that gets repeated. The thing that gets repeated, in this case, the veteran warriors questioning the distribution of Gedas and Time, that is the motif. And like I said, we want to be very careful that we're not imposing our own modern values on a text like this, especially if we're looking at an interpretation that doesn't exactly match the narration. So we do want to look for things like this motif. We see that this happens more than once, so it becomes, our attention is called to it. And we see it combined with other motifs, like Achilles looking at the scepter. The symbolism of Agamemnon's scepter is this tree that was cut and that will not continue to grow, will not continue to be alive. It will only serve Agamemnon, just like so many of these warriors that were killed only to serve Agamemnon. The motif whereby Nestor justifies Agamemnon's superiority by the number of troops he commands. We're going to see that, he's important because he commands the troops. Well, what do you tell the troops there? Why should we follow him if his authority depends on us? Aren't we the origin of that authority? Another one that I haven't mentioned that I do want to call our attention to is that back in Book 1, Achilles calls Agamemnon's followers non-entities because they follow him, because they're the ones not making decisions. He makes the decisions and they just do it. So it's almost like they're non-people. They're not fully human. They're not fully conscious. And it's also a pun. Utadanoi sounds like the danoi of the Danaans. That is the word that Agamemnon and others in the Iliad itself use for the Greeks. Remember, they don't use the word Greek. They are described as Achaeans or Danaans or Argives. And Danaans and Utadanoi sound similar. So these motifs, when you put them all together, point to a theme that is this larger, more abstract idea that the common troops are not receiving the same rewards, the same honor, the same fame that the aristocrats can. Despite the fact that they are the source of the rewards. They're out there on the battlefield. They are the source of the honor. Remember, Agamemnon outranks Achilles not because of his actions, but because of the number of men he commands. And they don't have the shot at fame. We're not going to remember them. Homer doesn't have the capability to name all of these people. So this common theme we get from Book 1, we can't just say, like, I see this thing happening and that's probably the theme. We need to be able to point to the text and say, here's several examples of these things, individual things like here's every time a warrior questions the distribution of Time and Gedas. Here's the symbolism of the scepter, and takes even crueler symbolism when Odysseus takes it and beats these common men with it. And the fact that Achilles is calling them non-people because they are not exercising their own autonomy. They're just letting Agamemnon tell them where to go and what to do, and they're not going to get anything out of this. These all together create this more abstract but more sort of universally recognizable theme that war tends to serve the commanders and not the troops. But we can see that there is this reflex by the characters to just take them in for granted, but the Iliad in Book 2 is preventing us from doing that. It is defamiliarizing this normal setup and making us recognize that these extras, these non-entities, they actually are entities. They have their own story. They have their own mental life. They have their own desires. They have their own fears. They are not just carbon copies. They're not clones of Agamemnon. But if this theme, and again, if I'm making the argument that this theme is something that makes sense to us today, that doesn't seem in line with the ideas about authority and hierarchy back then, I need to be very careful that I can prove that. And looking at these motifs, putting them together, seeing this larger theme emerge is one of the ways to do that. But there is one real key to making this argument that the description, the sort of denigration of Thersites in the narration might not actually be the only way to see this. And that is because the justification is based on Agamemnon's authority coming from Zeus. And Zeus says that today is the day for victory. Today is the day we take Troy. We know that's not going to be the case. Not only do we know that Agamemnon is a fool, is a child. Nepios, this is where we get the word like nepotism. But a child is not someone you want to be the leader of your army. And Homer, in the very beginning of the book 2, doesn't just say Agamemnon was wrong to believe this dream. He says he was a fool. He was a child. He had the mind of a child for believing this. So now, if this hierarchy is based on the assumption that Agamemnon's going to lead us correctly because he is chosen by Zeus, we already know that doing that is going to get a lot of men killed, and that is the point. And it's not that Zeus is mistaken. Zeus does this deliberately. So this is irony. This is the very sort of literary trope of irony, putting something, this artistic choice, to make two things irreconcilable and make sure the audience notices that. And there are different types of irony. There's situational irony, where something just defies expectations. There's verbal irony, where you're sort of sarcastic. You say something that's not true. It's not a lie. You communicate that you don't actually believe this, but you do it in such a hyperbolic way that people can see that you're saying the opposite of what you think. But what this is dramatic irony. What makes dramatic irony is the audience knows something the characters don't. And what the audience knows is that this chain of command that has Zeus at the top is one that is very bad for the people at the bottom. The chain of command is not justified. In fact, it's being exploited. That chain of command is being used against them by Zeus. Zeus's goal is to cause as many Greek deaths as possible to make Achilles feel worthy, or feel, appreciated, feel necessary. So he is using the confidence the men have in Agamemnon to get them killed, to get Agamemnon to take a stupid risk. He sends him this dream. So all of this has been organized. Zeus is exploiting this faith in the chain of command to get people killed. Okay, but if Homer is trying to call attention to the injustice faced by this multitude, why does he have Thersites, this guy he describes as ugly and nasty and bad and disrespectful? Why does he have him make the argument where somebody we like Odysseus, is making the exact opposite argument? Well, again, think about where Homer, as a poet, is going to be. If he's singing these stories, he's doing it in a competition that is organized and ruled over by the upper class. He is very likely not upper class. He is very likely maybe not, the common class, but he's going to be in the middle of the pyramid, if not toward the bottom. So he can't just question that in his society directly. He can't question it directly, but he's letting us remember the beginning of book 2 and recognize that, what I saw in the beginning totally conflicts with the argument that Odysseus and Nestor are making in book 2. And if Homer himself is, putting his own words in Thersites' mouth, it's not going to be obvious, because he just mocked Thersites before giving him this argument that's actually already been justified by both Achilles and by the events of the beginning of book 2. And then we get the people that are being foregrounded, that is the common men. They see Odysseus beat Thersites and chase him away. They see Thersites start crying, and the way they respond, we could just sort of briefly dismiss it as like, oh, they laughed at him because they didn't like him either. But that's not exactly what the narration tells us. It says the men were troubled, but they smiled and laughed, and they told each other, hey, this is something special. Odysseus has done things like this before, but he's done us a service. That guy was a windbag, right? Thersites, he's not going to come back here again insulting the rulers. But their discomfort here might be a familiar one. If you've ever been in a group of people that you felt like, I noticed something I should speak up about, but I didn't speak up about it. I'm afraid to speak up about it. I'm going to look around and see what other people do. And, well, nobody else is speaking up about it, so I'm not going to say anything either. I'm going to act like I'm on the same page as what I assume they are. And they might be acting a certain way because they think I think that way. And we all think the other one thinks something that we don't. This is called pluralistic ignorance. It actually is a unfortunately common phenomenon because people don't always want to let others know how they feel because they think they're going to be ridiculed or put on the outside of the group or even outright confronted. So we do get this awkwardness that the men can't express any kind of agreement with Thersites. But they don't have to. We already have Achilles has already done this before Thersites ever said it in Book 1. Now, another thing we're seeing in Book 2, it started in Book 1, is the portrayal of the gods. And you may have noticed that these gods don't follow the way we might expect them to. We don't see them portrayed the way we might expect gods to be portrayed. Zeus is dishonest. He is, if he wants to inflict harm on the Greeks, he could just, throw a lightning bolt down, which he will do later. But first, he's going to try these other tactics. Athena can't just make the Greeks win or make them turn around on her own. She needs to use Odysseus to change the minds of the men. There are no unambiguous interactions between the gods and mortals. All their actions are indirect. Or they act from a distance, such as Apollo sending the plague by shooting arrows from a distance, or Zeus throwing a thunderbolt in front of Diomedes, as he's going to do in Book 7. So no one sees the gods do these actions. We only see the effect of it. Now, there are exceptions. So Athena directly addresses Odysseus. She's in disguise. She directly addresses Achilles. She's not in disguise. Zeus sends a dream to Agamemnon, but he doesn't appear to him directly. So there is this sort of special revelation where gods interact directly with individuals, but it's always either in disguise or other people don't see it. They're usually disguised as specific humans rather than just a random unknown person. They can be recognized by certain details of their appearance. We're going to see that in Book 3. But if this seems like an almost sort of Hollywood version where the gods are portrayed as much more human than we might otherwise imagine them, this is actually going to be something that sets a standard in the Greek concept of their own gods. The historian Herodotus tells us 4 centuries after Homer that Homer and his contemporary poet, maybe slightly later, maybe a generation later, Hesiod, who writes Theogony, that is the origin of the gods, their understanding of the gods was largely based on the Iliad and the Odyssey and Hesiod's writings like the Works and Days and the Theogony. His quotation from his histories is Herodotus says, "Whence the several, from where the gods had their birth and whether they were all from the beginning, existing from the beginning, or what form they were, we did not learn until yesterday, figuratively speaking, as it were, or the day before. For Hesiod and Homer, I suppose, were for 400 years before my time, and not more. These are they who made the theogony for the Hellenes, for the Greeks, the Elos. And they gave the titles to the gods and distributed to them honors and arts and set forth their forms. But the poets who were said to have been before these men were really, in my opinion, after them. In other words, the ones who decided what the gods were going to be like were actually taking Homer and Hesiod as their idea." So to understand how the epic plays out, we need to understand how the gods work, how they think, and how they interact with other humans. One key component here is the Aegis. We read that Athena takes the Aegis, which belongs to Zeus, or it's identical with one owned by Zeus, and it's described as a goat skin. That is what the word Aegis seems to have come from. Homer tells us that bright-eyed Athena held her special goat skin, the precious, ageless, undying Aegis, from which 100 braided tassels flutter, each of pure gold, each worth 100 cattle. Wearing this cape, she dazzled as she swooped among the troops and urged the men. She roused in every heart the will to fight forever. And, these are the same guys that just a few minutes ago were running for the ships, packing up, ready to go home. Now, because, she sent Odysseus around to rally them, but now she herself is moving through the camp wearing this Aegis. She roused in every heart the will to fight forever. At once, the thought of war became to them sweeter than sailing home in the hollow ships, back to their native lands, the home they loved. So something about what she does and her use of the Aegis makes them instantly change their mood, maybe not their minds, but at least their feeling, so that whereas they had been longing for home just a minute ago, now they are longing to fight. This is not the only way the Aegis is going to be. We're going to see it used later to terrify people. Even warriors who actually have the advantage on the battlefield, a god will shake the Aegis in front of them, and it will make them terrified and make them run in terror. So again, this might not be something that matches our present schema, but we have to sort of learn how this works so that later we're going to notice when it shows up in an explanation. And we're going to need to understand that in order to understand what happens. Now, I do feel like, and this is just speculation, but the Aegis, the way it's described, sounds a lot like the sort of special cloaks or animal skins used in a lot of northern, like extreme northern, like Arctic cultures, that is decorated with bones or pieces of stone or chipped flint arrowheads or something like that, that is sort of designed to, when it moves, to make noise and look sort of unsettling, and could definitely be some part of some ancient battle ritual. That's pure speculation, but we do see parallels like that. So I'm definitely tempted to start doing some research and see what I can find from other cultures if we can see, because there's not very much of an explanation about the Aegis itself in ancient Greek literature. It's just sort of taken for granted. This is something that Zeus and Athena and at one point in the Iliad, Apollo has, that can either terrify soldiers on the battlefield or rally them, make them feel courageous. So this is a very shamanic seeming power, but that remains to be seen whether we can actually show a clear connection between this and older potential origins. I also should point out we will see several examples of sacrifice, particularly bull sacrifice in the Iliad, and we get one here in Book 2. We had one in Book 1, there's one in Book 2, there's another one in Book 3 before the duel between Menelaus and Paris. This is something that, as long as people have raised cattle, domesticated cattle, there is evidence of bull sacrifices being like the highest sacrifice people could make to different gods. As soon as people started domesticating cattle, great importance was placed on the specific ceremony in sacrificing those bulls to their gods. Speaking of the gods and sacrifice and the assumption that gods will respond to sacrifices by either giving the sacrificer what they're asking for or at least making some sort of response. We do have the reference here that Odysseus reminds his audience that before the events of the Iliad, before the Greeks even made it to Troy, when the Greek ships were all waiting for the right winds to start blowing so that they could sail to Troy, there was a sign that followed a sacrifice that the soothsayer, the prophet that Calchas, who works for Agamemnon, interpreted. Immediately after this sacrifice, the Greeks witnessed a snake that eats these 8 little chicks of these birds, and finally eats the mother, so eats 9 in total. And Calchas interprets that to mean that 9 years will go by before the Greeks will finally consume Troy. And so this is something that actually shows up in the Cypria, the other work of the epic cycle. Now, does that mean that it was in the Cypria first before the Iliad was composed, or was the Cypria composed second and included this because it was known from the Iliad? We can't say. It could definitely go either way. But here, too, we might see a little bit of irony, because that seems like a really abstract way to answer or reply to a sacrifice. Remember, we just saw Zeus send a dream to Agamemnon. That's one way he could have responded, much more direct. At least you get the explanation verbatim from the dream personified that is what Zeus told him to say. We also have seen Athena twice directly approach and speak to a mortal, Achilles in Book 1 and Odysseus in Book 2. So how much importance and reliability can we place on this really vague explanation? You're going to see this a lot, and you're going to see people like Calchas interpret the flights of birds, and that just seems like unnecessarily vague when we also have gods directly addressing humans. And I don't think that's unintentional. I think we're looking at people who, again, the dramatic irony here, we see what the gods are thinking. We see sometimes the gods directly talk to individuals, but most of these guys, the characters, don't see that. Odysseus and Achilles obviously know when Athena is talking to them, but the vast majority of these characters don't know that the gods will just show up and speak to some of them directly. So we're starting to see here, and with when Agamemnon makes the sacrifice in Book 2, and we're told Zeus took the sacrifice, but he did not grant the request. He would not give them victory over Troy, but he'd still take the sacrifice. We get a pretty ironic interpretation of the gods here. And if Herodotus is correct that Homer is one of the main influences on Greek religion in the classical period, 400 years later, there must have been a healthy amount of skepticism about just how effective the gods are. Sometimes they give us these, weird, random, very open to interpretation signs. Sometimes they just come and talk to us directly. Sometimes when they talk to us directly, they're lying to us. They are actively trying to get us killed. Well, if this is their Bible, essentially, you got to think that a lot of Greeks are very skeptical of how they interact with their gods. Well, a generation after Herodotus, there was another Greek contrarian that was famously ugly and just as insolent as Thersites. That Thersites of the classical era is Socrates. And in Plato's dialogue, the Phaedrus, Socrates is talking to his student named Phaedrus. And Phaedrus asks, does it matter if what we say is true or not? As long as it's persuasive. Isn't it better to be persuasive than to be accurate? And it's at that point that Socrates quotes Nestor from Book 2 of the Iliad, when Nestor tells Agamemnon to make his own decision, but do so after listening to others. The word of the wise is not to be passed by. Well, Socrates quotes that line and then goes on to echo Homer's theme, which is, pay attention to what the authorities have to say, but make up your own mind. He goes on to then compare the two Athenian teachers of rhetoric that they're talking about to Odysseus and Nestor, and the two main speakers of Book 2. And at least as far as Socrates' interpretation, it seems like Book 2 has a lot of subtle hints that you should listen to the authorities, whether they're the gods or the kings or the chain of command. But in the end, you should make up your own mind. So Book 2 introduces us to the characters of Thersites and Odysseus. We have a few themes like the multitude who are going to fight and suffer, and they're going to die, but without the reward or glory that the aristocrats like Achilles can expect. There's going to be a lot of trying to figure out how to persuade people to act against their own best interest. There's just so many anonymous warriors here are required to enable these feats of these main characters, not to mention eventually conquer Troy. And we're given a lot of motifs that hint at a theme of questioning authority and the accuracy of divination. Remember the concept of the epic simile, dramatic irony, the theme and the motif. And we're going to see, especially in books 1 through 6, that there's a lot of diegesis setup. That is like narrative, like here's something that you're going to need to know later. A lot of this kind of setting things up. And I'll go ahead and kind of hint in this direction. One of the things that Homer does in Book 2 is foreground these underappreciated people, the difficulties they have to go through, the fact that they have to do the same sacrifice as Achilles. They just don't get the same potential reward, and they are going to be the ones that are going to be hurt by Achilles' wounded pride. In Book 19, we're going to see Achilles is completely oblivious to this, oblivious to the suffering of others, even though that suffering is so much like his own. It also establishes Odysseus as a motivational speaker, someone who can persuade other people. And this is probably something that most of Homer's audience would have already known, but it's going to set him up to fail in Book 9 when he's trying to persuade Achilles. And then, of course, the catalog of the ships, as well as these epic similes, establish just how big the war that's mostly in the background for most of the epic, just how big an event this is. So with that, Book 1 establishes the conflict and the menace specific to Achilles and Agamemnon. Book 2 sort of zooms out and shows just how big the social implications of this are, the number of people involved in this giant event. Now, next in Book 3, we're going to look not just at the larger war as it's happening right then, but we're going to look at the war as its own story. That is not the story of Achilles, but the story of Helen being taken from Sparta, being taken from her husband Menelaus, and Paris, the guy who took her. This triangle, the conflict here being between these three, that's going to come back into focus in book 3.